Hi, I'm Nolan Dennis. I'm going to be hosting this special edition of Bubblegum Connect with Sumayya Vally, architect, educator, designer, interdisciplinary thinker, friend, importantly a friend, Time 100 special thinkers, I mean kind of everything. Yeah, welcome. The last time I saw you was online at the Serpentine, what's it called? Like the shape of a circle in the mind of a fish. It was kind of about general ecology, but you were talking about a specific person. Who are you talking about?
Well, I did two contributions for the symposium actually. So for the first one, I was speaking with Yasmin Lari, who's an architect in Pakistan, and we worked together. Yasmin's like the star architect, prima donna, as she calls herself, of Pakistan, the first female architect, was very involved in building Pakistan post-partition. But she gave all that up recently during her retirement to develop a kind of ecological approach that goes back to really traditional architecture and architectural forms. And I worked with her a little bit a few years ago on some of the research that involved working with women and building chula stoves. And the other contribution was about Joburg. It was called Ingesting Architectures on Atmospheric Violences. And I went into apartheid in the atmosphere and how we ingest dust and the violence of that. And the contribution just goes through all the scales of segregation that we have in Joburg, from the zoomed out macro scale of planning to the microscopic scale of dust.
Thank you, because the thing I wanted to use that to think about was your practice and your kind of personal history in relation to like your design practice, but through Johannesburg. And I remember your graduate thesis was about the mine dumps and this kind of ecological landscape that we're in, but in Johannesburg doesn't read like ecology. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and how your experience of living in Johannesburg, studying in Johannesburg, has like informed your practice.
I grew up and I was born in Lodium in Pretoria, which is an apartheid Indian township, very small town. I went to the Pretoria Muslim school my whole life. And I had this other side of my childhood that was in Johannesburg. My grandfather was a store owner on Ntami Street, so I spent a lot of my childhood in that part of Joburg, in the inner city. My mom is from inner city Joburg as well. And I think that I had very formative experiences of walking in the city and of being in Joburg. I have great memories of walking to the Joburg Library, and I often attribute my wanting to study architecture or to be an architect to that experience of being in the library, which was much more romantic, of course, as a child, with all the domes and vaulted ceilings and so on, but also with being immersed in fiction and being lost in books and yeah. So I think I had an experience of a very urban Joburg very early on. I used to, walk by myself as a very young child to buy masala chip rolls across the road and to the library and so on. And I think I reconnected with that after my undergraduate studies in Pretoria. I did a lot of volunteering and NGO work and so on, and I worked a little bit in museum practice when I was taking a break from the profession of architecture. And I completely fell in love with Joburg and with the side of Joburg and these sides of Joburg that we weren't being taught about at school. And I think I carried that into my postgraduate, which is why I came to study at Wits, because I really wanted to be in the city. And yeah, I think throughout the experience of studying and being with my friends, and you know what that's like, we did a lot in the city, and we used the time studying to really be in Johannesburg. And Counterspace was also formed off the back of that experience of wanting to be in the city, of wanting to engage with it, of developing a curriculum and a practice out of being in Johannesburg. And I think out of searching for and finding design form for these experiences in Joburg, that we don't necessarily have architectural language.
There are like two things I want to, and I'm not sure how to get there, but one is fiction. Maybe that's a place to start, because you just mentioned being in the city but immersed in fiction, and later a lot of your academic work is about opening architecture to the kind of flows of fiction or speculation. And I don't really have a question, but I just want you to talk about like architecture and fiction and speculation, and maybe, I guess what's nice about what you just said is that the city is quite a real thing to you. And I think the way design practices, architecture in particular, deal with space is often as a fiction, as something that can be like manipulated and shifted really seamlessly. But I think your work and like the kind of research you've been doing, even with Counterspace and in the academy, it's always been, at least to me, like pushing back against the seamlessness of design, you know, like the complications of kind of reality. And yeah, I don't know, maybe there's something I'd just like to talk about, like complications of reality, the complications of fiction, and maybe why fiction is important to you as a designer.
Okay.
In Johannesburg.
You can help me a bit, I think. Yeah, I think that we imagine or we see architecture as very real and very static, but architecture also starts off as a fiction. And I think that fiction and architecture at their hearts are both very propositional. Apartheid was someone's fiction before it existed. And I know that sounds obvious, but I think that any architectural form or structure also first starts off completely propositionally. It starts off as an idea in someone's mind, and then it's written into and realized into being in the same way. But that's not so much how we understand it. I think either we understand it as completely fantastical, or as you mentioned, kind of sanitized and removed from the realities of the city and of our ways of being. Or we imagine that we don't have any agency in the profession at all, and that it's almost like already dictated to us. But I think that in between those two things, there is something really important about fiction in what it has to say about who we are and about our stories. And Octavia Butler has been on my mind a lot recently, NASA considering and everything. Yeah, I know, amazing. But I think that, and I think it's often said, I think Arundhati Roy and several other authors, Toni Morrison also, have spoken about fiction as really important truths. And I think in my academic work, I also often use fiction to talk about things that are really difficult to talk about directly. And I think that ways of storytelling, whether it, and you know, if we go across the spectrum of fiction, whether it's writing or performance or kind of stage setting and so on, are really important tools to be able to convey and to tell us stories. And I see architecture as within that realm also. But I think absolutely it is also a medium to convey complexities, messiness, difficulties, but of course also imagination and proposition. And I think that fiction is a medium that can hold all those things together, and so can architecture.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I was just thinking, perseverance. It's perseverance, right? Landed on Mars, and then they named that landing site Octavia E. Butler Landing, and like that is also just the greatest fiction of all time, you know, the like projection of this. Like,
and the moment we're in and what that means, and
these geographic practices, like we can just name a part of Mars after someone, and there's something really for me quite exciting about that. But it also makes me think of your Serpentine Commission, and how your practice, which seems quite grounded in you know, the experience of this city, but in general working in like quite intimate ways with the context, how you, firstly, how does it feel to be the 2020 Serpentine Pavilion architect? And then on top of that, how do you kind of think and feel about maybe also being a kind of alien presence in that environment, you know? Like how, I don't know, to me that it just seems like a beautifully kind of science fiction adventure to go to Hyde Park and do something. Or maybe it should also say that it's 2021 now, and the
2020/21.
Yeah, but it's also been delayed by...
It's been extended.
Extended, excuse me. It's also been extended by worldly conditions. And maybe all of these feelings are all mixed up, so you can just talk about them all.
Yeah, I guess it felt a lot when the commission happened, because I think for me it really meant a lot that an institution like the Serpentine, which I've looked up to for a really long time, I've obviously followed all of the pavilions and gotten really excited about many of them. It meant a lot for an institution like the Serpentine to want to work with a practice like ours. And I think that, I mean, it would have also meant something else, I think, had it happened in 2020. But it happened a little bit before some of what the world experienced last year. And I think that carrying that energy into whatever else we experienced last year has also meant a lot to me. And that's also why I say the commission's been extended, because subsequent to the pandemic and some of the institutional awakenings that the world is facing with the rupture of the Black Lives Matter movement, it's also given me a lot of time to think about what this commission in particular means, and what the original intent meant, and how that can be deepened or extended with the extra time and with all of the extra reminders that we have at the moment. And I think that being from Joburg, I always thought that my practice is very much rooted here. And whenever I got asked if I have aspirations or ambitions to practice and work elsewhere, I always, and I'm sure we also talked about it, saw my practice very much as being in Johannesburg. And I think you also went through something similar. We talked about it before, at least. But I feel, and when we got asked to make a submission, I thought very much about what my lens and way of seeing in Joburg can bring to another context. And in a way, I think it's not so much about being grounded in Johannesburg, but it's about a training that Joburg has given me and a way of seeing that I'm becoming attuned to, or that I'm searching for in Joburg, that I tried to bring to this commission. So, you know, I think on the one hand, looking at Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens was quite daunting for me and for a practice like mine. But the more I looked at it, the more I felt like it was waiting for a gesture, and that I wanted to bring what London is to that part of London. So to expand the platform and to bring together the different voices from different parts of London to Kensington Gardens. And I think there's also something about other stories and other narratives in whichever language possible that Counterspace is interested in. So I tried to approach the commission in that way also.
Yeah, I can relate, and I appreciate your, I don't know, maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but your idea of Johannesburg as both a place, but also like a set of tools or a set of strategies that you can like deploy in different contexts, you know? And it seems like, yeah, to think about Hyde Park with the tools of Johannesburg is maybe something that's kind of emerging from the commission, but also there's just something inside, and maybe it's I'm really interested in the role of fiction, and there's something that sounds like you can Johannesburgify Kensington Gardens, and that for me is super exciting. You know? It also removes architecture from some of what I think are its more depressing, formal concerns, and it takes it into this like kind of exciting space where you can like bring. I mean, it's also funny to me to think that a young South African can go to London and be like, I'm going to bring London to Kensington, but that's maybe the Johannesburg spirit, you know? Those are the tools to like shake things up. I mean, I think what for me is really nice about those moments, and similar to the Serpentine Commission, Time 100 Next Thinkers Doers, is that it puts you in a kind of cohort, you know, like you're now kind of surrounded by peers, at least one version of what your peers are. And in the Serpentine Commission, that's really interesting and really funny, because I guess you have to also choose of all of the people who've done Serpentine Commissions, which ones, because on one hand there's like Björn Ingalls, on the other hand there's Zaha Hadid, you know? But for the Time one, I really appreciated that the group of people they brought together, and to me I think you fit perfectly in that scene, because you're kind of on the front of what's to come, right? This is my gift. This is the truth I give you.
Thank you, I'm receiving.
But yeah, maybe the question is, like, of these people, who do you kind of feel some resonance with? Who do you feel like, and maybe not just those people, who do you think that you're kind of working in parallel with? Who's your community of inspiration or collaboration? Or there's a nice word I've discovered, instead of like a viewership, or you have a thinkership. It's like the people you're thinking together with. So who are those people for you?
Yeah, I think it's amazing to be on a list with the likes of Talfa, who you mentioned as well, and just I think there are so many brilliant thinkers who have been so brave, but I think Talfa stands out because there is a way that both history and identity and future is being carried in their work, which really, really resonates with me and which I also hope to bring in my practice.
Yeah, so you're really invested in other forms of design, fashion, clothing, jewelry, and I guess my question is, how does this general interest in design, and also there's something about design for the body, and yeah, so how does this general interest in design inform your design thinking in architecture?
I think I've always seen them as all related and as forms of architecture in a way, and I know that architects say that, and I think that lots of architects are invested in lots of other forms of design, but I think in particular for here and for many of my cultural hyphenated backgrounds as well, there is so much to learn from and to see in and to bring out in these other forms of design, in ritual objects and in jewelry and forms of adornment and garments, and you know, those are also part of the ways that we tell our stories and the way that we bring expression to our lives. And I think that for our context in particular, those are also really intertwined with architecture and space making. If we think about rituals and about occasions, I'm speaking specifically to my own cultural background, but how we adorn ourselves is as much for me a part of you know, some forms of space making as the built and the architectural. And in many of my students' works as well, and in my teaching studio, we often work with the body, and we work with hybrids between performance garments and architectural objects and architecture, kind of all rolled in one. Because I think that there's something in these other ways of being. Clothing is just one of them, but there are many others. Ritual is another. There are many, many others as well. That is ahead of architecture in many senses for our context. And I think that our architecture has been sanitized out of those things. Of course, I think if we think traditionally to, I don't know, architectural essays that advocate for the sanitization, there's so much to be said for injecting like magic and you know, something else into those environments that is errant and is rebellious and is revolutionary for those contexts, but also more than that, it just is our way of being, and I think that's something that we can bring to, or that architecture can draw on to push itself forward. I'm really interested in how all of these other ways of being and forms of design and forms of expression can be brought to architecture. And I think in Joburg in particular, so many of these other forms like music and film and visual arts are way ahead of architecture. And I understand that's because architecture has a lag and it's a very slow profession, but I also think that for our ways of space making and ways of being, there are so many things in Joburg that happen in much more agile, instant ways that are much more about the oral and about the design of the environment beyond just the static that we can bring to architecture.
the beautiful thing about your interest in fiction, your interest in the city, your interest in education, I think for me is because it all orbits around a question of transformation, like radical transformation. And we see in like popular art, culture, fashion, the ability to like very quickly and in like very meaningful ways perform transformation. In architecture, that transformation is much more difficult to enact, but even to see. And my question is, as an architect who also doesn't build a lot, because you're, exactly, because you're young, come from a particular background, you're working in a particular context where only money goes to certain, flows in certain directions. How does all of these things you've been speaking about, like interest in the city, the life of the city, fiction, kind of fashion design, popular design, how does this kind of inform or maybe, I guess it seems to me that it would help in a context where design commissions are not flowing to people like you, to have this expanded view. Maybe there's something to talk about. I'm just curious about what it feels like to be an amazing architect who just is not getting...
Doesn't have access.
Yeah, to commissions, to building commissions particularly.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that's really important for us to talk about and to bring up in conversation. Yeah, and I also think that practicing in the expanded field partly rose out of necessity because we had to build whatever we could get our hands on. So, I've worked on everything from set design to art installation to publications, books, and I do see all of those as forms of architecture. But I also deeply believe in working at different speeds all at once, because you mentioned that architecture is very slow. I think that often architecture is also very abstract, and because of that it does take a longer time for it to translate questions of transformation. But I think that to be able to practice at different speeds, which you mentioned, for example, the education space, I think is a very luxuriously slow space. It allows a lot of time for thinking, and other spaces, the space of installations or of city activations, of, I don't know, designing a story booth in a community around oral history, that might happen instantaneously. But I think all of these different speeds are asking the same question, just testing it at different speeds. And I think it's really important to be engaged in all of those speeds at once, because if one is only engaged in the sphere of hardcore everyday practice, I think there's the risk of losing some of the imagination and the thought space that a research space allows. But at the same time, if we're only engaged in the research space, I think that maybe we run the risk of navel-gazing sometimes. So I believe, because I think that we have inherited, or we have to inherit the project of transformation, we have to take it on to start answering those questions. I also think that we often say that it's unfair to ask questions about African identity or about being able to express what our different design languages are, because there hasn't been enough time to answer the question. But at the same time, I also think that we do have to take the questions on in as many disciplines, as many formats, as many speeds as possible, because they kind of catalyze each other, and there's a dance between those spaces that informs the other.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. It's really rare to like just speak to a friend and an inspiration, I'm gonna say, in this way. You know, we see each other a lot, but we never have an opportunity to just, you know, yeah, so thank you, and yeah, thank everyone, thank Bubblegum Club for connecting us on this special episode. Yeah.